Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. Today, this interview is directed at CIOs. What I've done is I found through one of you a software vendor that is killing it for CIOs. This particular piece of software is designed for you. It's essentially look at it as a CRM or an ERP for CIOs. Many of you are out in the business solving problems for the business, helping the business integrate solutions for themselves, whether it be finance, sales, marketing systems. You're helping all of the business unit heads and leaders. But what about yourselves? How are you solving your own enterprise resource planning, your IT resource planning for your business? So a good friend of mine who has been on the program before, Bob Fecto, is the CIO of SAIC. He directed me to this software that he's had a tremendous amount of success with, and it's called Apptio. And the founder of Apptio is named Sunny. And Sunny immigrated from India and has a fascinating story that I get into with him. And within the first minute or two, it's a little bit choppy for about 20 seconds, but essentially he talks about how his father gave him $2,000 and said, you can go to American University, but I can give you no more. And so it's a true entrepreneurial success. Sunny's had many, many successes with different software companies, but he's had a 10-year run with Apptio. And it's really interesting because it's a very mission-driven organization. And if you at all want to learn about how you build transparency within your organization through accounting, through the practice of running IT, through really driving trust across the business so that they look at you, you have a seat at the table, but not based on emotion, but based on facts. So how you build a defensible program within your organization. We've talked about how the difference between defense and offense within your organization. We talk about looking at comprehensive IT spending, vendor spending, cloud spending. And again, how you pull all of this together to tell a story, to tell a narrative, to build context around what you're trying to achieve within the IT organization. If you like the word building an office of the CIO, why not? And so we're going to talk about changing language and developing leaders of the future. I feel we're at an inflection point. I don't believe a piece of software like this, and Sunny and I talk about it, we don't think this would have worked in the 90s or even in the 2000s. I think this type of an approach to bringing IT together would only work today. And I think many of you are at that point where you're looking to up-level your skills for leadership, up-level your skills as a leader of the most important business unit in a business. And I believe many of you do understand that the CIOs are going to be the CEOs of the future. So with that, enjoy my conversation with Sunny Gupta, who's the CEO of Apptio. Sunny, well, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So before we get started, I think it would be great just for us to take a step back and if you could just introduce yourself to my audience. They've gotten a bit of an overview already about your series of successes, but what's not really captured on the LinkedIn profile perspective is where did it start? Where did you grow up and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, hi. So I'm currently the CEO of Apptio, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But really, my journey started, I grew up in a town called Chandigarh, north of New Delhi in India, and came to the US for my undergraduate education back in 1989. And the interesting story is my father gave me basically $2,000 ticket just because of my education. So came to the US, went to university and started to graduate computer science and math. And given I had left my family and I was on pretty tight budget, I worked tirelessly through the school and also wanted to graduate at a faster pace. So I completed my undergrad degree in 3 years and frankly never called my parents back for any money. And that kind of started my journey into entrepreneurship, where I really felt like I didn't want to go through that experience ever again in my life. And I just wanted to do something extraordinary, work for a couple of large companies like IBM, and became an entrepreneur very early. When I was 26, started my first company, got acquired by another technology company in Seattle, worked at a large company called Rational Software, which is now part of IBM, and then had a series of entrepreneurial stints, which eventually led me to Apptio.
So you've had a series of successes with different businesses since you graduated, but you've settled into Apptio for almost a decade now, right?
Yeah, the Apptio was started back in 2007, fall of 2007, although we started thinking about the idea in the summer of 2007. So yeah, this is exciting, but this is the longest place I've ever worked in my professional career, and I'm loving it, and it feels like really the super early days of Apptio for me still.
No, it seems like that. And I thought, gosh, 10 years. And I thought, well, that's really, really cool. And I'd love to know, like, what was the originating thought around Apptio? Like, was it a coffee shop conversation? Was it just a sequence from one business to the next? You just knew this was going to be the next one? Or what was the genesis of Apptio from a thought perspective?
Yeah, so really the genesis of Apptio story started back in 2007. I had sold my previous company, I Conclude, to Opsware, which was a publicly traded company run by Mark Andreessen and Ben Hurwitz, who are leading venture capitalists now. And I was part of the Opsware management team, and we had sold that business to HP for $1.6 billion. And really, this was the summer of 2007, where I felt like my previous company had gotten sold too early, and I really didn't know what to do next in my professional career, but there was this very unsatisfying feeling inside me. And I was in my 30s, and I was contemplating whether I should go into the venture capital or whether I should do something more into the entrepreneurial space. And I was traveling to New York, specifically talking to some of our large customers who were customers of Opsware. I remember sitting with the CIO of Goldman Sachs, and he asked me, what am I going to do next? And I started asking him what some of the challenges they were facing in IT. And he just started describing that really IT is more fundamentally complex than ever, more strategic than ever, powering every major business process in the enterprise. And he said, I specifically remember that, hey, while the CIO has many technical systems like automation, monitoring, service management, but there's really nothing to manage the business and analytics and decision-making for the CIO. And that 5-minute conversation turned into an hour. And on a long plane ride home, I started thinking, wow, why hasn't this problem been solved before? Why hasn't somebody innovated in this area? And then that was really the early genesis of Apptio. I talked to probably 40, 50 customers, CIOs, large and small. And I remember waking up in the fall of 2007 and telling my wife that, hey, I'm ready to build the next Salesforce.com for the CIO. And that's when I knew that I wanted to start Apptio.
I think that what's really interesting is I love, and this is part of what I try to teach in our groups here. I think the CIO is just really interesting listening to your story. You had the ability to take a problem and reconstitute it into a solution set from just listening to one CIO, and then that morphed into 40 more conversations. And then all of a sudden it was the genesis of something substantial and something of value to the CIO. That's powerful. And I think every CIO can learn from that story.
I often, even today, we feel like we are just learning, continuously learning and morphing. And frankly, I would also say, even from the first day, the meta level idea has not changed, but the business plan, frankly, from even the early part of 2007 to what Apptio is today is fundamentally different. And that would not be possible if we weren't listening. Listening is one thing, but the second most important piece is morphing. When you're listening continuously, but also morphing the idea to kind of really evolve into what our company is today. And that's, certainly empathizing so much for the CIOs. I know technology is changing at such a fast pace that that's a fundamental thing they must do, whether it's externally what's happening, but also what may be the different needs, if you will, which are emerging within their enterprise. So listening and morphing is critical to the success of every CIO.
When you say morphing, can you explain maybe some more detail? What do you mean by morphing or an example?
Yeah, I'll give you a specific example in our business, but morphing, really what I mean is when you listen, your feedback, which you may be hearing from your counterparts or your customers, may be different than what you may have in mind. So ability to change your ideas, ability to change your execution plan based on hearing from people. In our case, when we started Apptio, we were first thinking about not necessarily targeting the CIO because we thought it would be very hard to get the CIO's attention for a very small company, which didn't really have a broad footprint. And a lot of CIOs said that, hey, it'd be very hard for CIOs to return your phone calls and so forth, right? We're all busy, especially the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 CIOs. So our original idea was really to target directors within IT. So director of desktop, director of compute, director of storage. So really 2 to 3 levels below the CIO, we thought it'll be easier for us to gain traction and we'll sell them smaller footprint products. But as we started engaging with the CIOs, they said, look, this is kind of really tied to the transformation which is happening in the CIO. And you better, even though you're a small no-name company, you will get a lot of traction because we are all technologists wanting to be business people without going to business school. So Apptio could be one of the platforms. So you should try targeting us directly and providing our value proposition to us. And this is a decision which only CIO along with the CFO can make. And the lower level people in the organization may not be able to make such a decision. So frankly, we listened and we tried a few things and that strategy started to work. So that's a really good example of morphing and listening to your customers.
Would you say it's accurate, or was it too simplified for me to say Apptio is similar to an ERP for the CIO or financial accounting system for the CIO? Or how do you describe yourselves, or is that too simplistic the way I said it?
No, I think that's very simple. I think that's a really good analogy. Really, the way we talk about this is that, look, every function in the enterprise has a business management system. So if you think about the CFO has ERP or financial management systems, the head of sales has CRM systems, head of marketing has marketing automation like Marketo or Eloqua style systems, and the CIO may have many technical systems, but they really don't have a business management system. So really what CRM does for the head of sales, Apptio does for the CIO to help them manage the business of technology.
Yeah, and I one of the things that as I was introduced to you is it seemed like you've kind of carved out a segment, and what I mean by that is, the CIO is a relatively new position as compared to the CFO or to the CEO or president or operations. I mean, we can trace back to probably the founding, at least to the Industrial Revolution, or even maybe back, I think they had numbers in accounting back in the Greeks, or not Greeks, but the Egyptians. But certainly in the 80s and 90s, we really saw this growing of the CIO. So we really don't have a long track record. Are you finding that it's an opportunity to settle in and kind of create the space, or sort of a hindrance because people are confused, Sonny?
Yeah, I would say that's very accurate, that the CIO function is a very new function in the grand scheme of things when you compare to a lot of the other peers in the enterprise. And that's actually been a good enabler for us. And frankly, the CIO function has primarily been focused on managing the technology itself. They've been managing and putting in place technology for the business. And primarily, they've been back office. And we are seeing massive changes in that CIO function, where now they're going from being the back office to front office. And given the strategic importance of technology, they have to become more business stewards. They cannot be just technologists. And really, that is creating a massive opportunity. Now, the CIO is very used to buying ERP systems. They're very used to buying CRM systems. They're very used to buying back office systems like mail, Office 365 or those type of systems, but they're not really used to buying business software and business analytics for themselves, for their own functions. So that's what's the opportunity. So really, we find ourselves in a fascinating mix where the CIO function may be new. They're used to doing things a certain way, like ERP and so forth, but we're also providing them a catalyst for the new transformation which is happening. So it's really the world they've lived in, but also the world they need to live in.
So what you're saying is that they're so used to solving other people's problems that now it's almost like the Cobblers. What's the Cobblers story where the Cobblers kids have no shoes sort of thing? You almost have to, you're turning it back on themselves in some respects to kind of solve their own issues.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we use that statement all the time. Cobblers' children having no shoes. And really, I think if Apptio could not have existed, in my opinion, in the late 90s, right? I mean, that was the era of ERP, and that was the era of CRM systems with Siebel, Salesforce, marketing automation systems. So IT's strategic importance needed to go way beyond from the back office to front office. Spend in technology needed to rise. Certainly the cloud created a level of complexity in the IT operating model for the CIO. 70% of every CIO's budget was tied in run or maintenance activities. And finally, the CIO function got to a place where just being that function for management of the technology was no longer sufficient. They needed to demonstrate the business value of technology investments. They needed to be better stewards of managed capital, right, which is fundamentally the organization's capital. And technology was fundamentally a black box. And so that became the catalyst. So really, when we started the business in 2007, I personally believe that our category couldn't have been done earlier. And now we are seeing a tipping point, right, given sort of what has even happened in the last 10 years.
I agree with you. I think there's a timing to this all. And also, I agree with you that it's funny, there's been so much time to mature the other ends of the business because they've had time. And they've had time for even a lot of market ups and a lot of market collapses have kind of built sort of the accounting fundamentals and the auditing foundation practices for CPAs. Like the CFO, in my opinion, has a massive advantage because they can hire people to follow GAAP accounting principles, debits, credits, income statements, balance sheets. But we're having that language that really all people, even if you're an English major in college, you have to take some business classes that you understand those fundamentals. Largely on the IT side, we've missed that language. So it seems in some respect, you've also inserted a framework of language and of transparency, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you kind of brought this up. When I first started talking to a lot of executives, both in CIO function, but also the CFO function, what you're saying is really what CIOs and CFOs were telling us, that, hey, the finance leaders have a GAAP accounting standards, and it's a fairly standard ways to read a balance sheet or an income statement, but they were which existed for IT leaders. So I remember back in 2010, when there are 5 or 6 of our large CIOs, I remember the CIO of Cisco, for example, Rebecca Jacoby at that time. She used to work for John Chambers at Cisco, and few others from very large scale organizations coming to me and saying that, hey, what the problem which Apptio is trying to solve is pretty universal, but one of the things we want you to consider is create an organization which is just purely dedicated to creating standards, very similarly to what the CFO has. So would you consider creating a nonprofit organization? And we took their feedback and we created a nonprofit organization called Technology Business Management Council, or the TBM Council. And it's really dedicated to creating an industry standard taxonomy and an operating model for the CIO. Like, what are all the services and products a CIO delivers? Infrastructure services, end user computing like mobility, telecom, applications, as well as business capability like order to cash. And that taxonomy did not exist before. A standard cost model did not exist before. Many of our customers had on-premise and cloud services. How do you account for those things? How do you account for fixed versus variable spending? How do you account for change run, transform capability? How do you account for a standardized way for a CIO to have a conversation with the business leader within their enterprise? So we've created a lot of these standards underneath the TBM Council, which is now up till 5,400 members, led by 20 leading CIOs. And it's really become the catalyst. It's become the standard way of how CIOs are communicating the business value, measuring themselves, benchmarking themselves, and really managing this very complex hybrid IT landscape. So the standards, we believe, are key, but we also believe that, we are frankly at a very, very early stages of this. And if you fast forward 10 years from now, we believe this will be similar to what the GAP standard is for the CFO function.
I agree with you. And it's one of these pieces that we won't have as we're going to mature, but these standards are going to mature at pace. We're not going to have endless years to figure them out. They're almost going to have to be, they're going to have mobility and change built into them. I'm curious, though, what you think about how do you feel the speed and pace of change? What role does Apptio play with speed? Like, for example, is there a way that you can take things out that never change so that there's a standard of things that we know of how to communicate that they're never going to change? So now we can move fast around things that are innovative? Or how do you see people able to go more confidently achieve innovation and dive into more transformation with your product?
Yeah, so, I would say you're absolutely right, Bill. There are certain parts of the operating model for the CIO which are not really changing, right? So CIO will always have to provide infrastructure services, whether they are procured from external sources like Amazon, Azure, or whether they are built internally in their own on-premise data centers. They always have to provide application capabilities. They always have to still provide things like telecom, mobility, computing, right? Those things are not changing. They have to manage their spend. They have to manage at a granular level. They have to do planning. They have to continuously do cost optimization. They have to continuously free up capital from running to kind of more innovation, right? Those things are going to remain very, very constant. What is really changing is the two things, in my opinion. One is the digital enterprise technology is more strategic than ever, and the CIO is being asked to leverage technology to deliver fundamentally more business innovation, new revenue streams, automation of labor within manual processes, and technology has fundamentally become more strategic. Every company is a technology company. So that's one thing which is changing at a much faster pace because technology is a boardroom dialogue now. And the second thing which is changing is the underneath technologies and the vendor landscape at a pretty massive pace, right? So the pace of innovation in cloud services, where you can now go buy compute, storage, higher level services like Lambda and so forth, databases, that pace of technology innovation is at a much, much faster pace. And that's creating a fundamental shift in the operating model and at the pace of which the CIO has to react. They have to continue to do maintenance and running their services, but they also have to be able to act at the pace of the business and also leverage these new technologies. And that fundamentally creates additional challenges. So some things remain the same. And really the role which Apptio plays is helping any CIO get deep transparency into their technology spending. So really with our cloud-based applications, technology leaders can really manage, plan, and optimize their technology investments across both on-premise and cloud services. And then they can measure the investments in these new digital platforms by funding them, by even squeezing out funding from existing run paradigms, and also kind of manage this very ever-changing, complex vendor landscape. So that's kind of the opportunity we see ahead of us.
It's interesting, in the innovation group that I host for CIOs in the Mid-Atlantic area, we talk about offense and defense. I actually break the group into offense, innovation, and defense. And I often think that defense can be the new offense. And what's interesting is you talk transparency for me engenders and brings up defense. But I think when you talk about transparency, and I'd like for you to talk about it further, I actually think it actually opens up offense opportunities for the CIO that they otherwise wouldn't know. But maybe you can talk about what's the current state that you see for transparency with the CIO and kind of where you see that moving over the next couple of years and what opportunities you see for the CIO that are able to kind of achieve these new levels of transparency in their organization.
Yeah, so Bill, you're so right around the defense versus offense. Basically, you can think of transparency as defense, but really, if you think about the forward-leaning CIOs who have really adopted our platform and solutions, what they're really doing is, look, the reality is you can't really optimize something which you don't have transparency into. So majority of the CIOs we engage with have some level of transparency. They have to, right? Otherwise, it's very hard for you to operate these environments. But they don't really have the granularity of the transparency, and they don't have really data-driven decision-making capability at their fingertips. It's very hard to do that on Excel. So they are leveraging the Apptio solution to get deep transparency, more granular transparency, more automated transparency into their services and products, into what part of the spend is change versus run, fixed versus variable, what part is on the cloud services versus on-premise, so they're able to make data-driven decisions. And some of the forward-leaning CIOs are using that transparency to create a different type of dialogue with the business, because part of the issue of technology investments is that the business does not really understand the true cost, fully loaded cost of running and operating technology services. So a lot of these CIOs are using this transparency to create an offense dialogue. They're saying, look, the cost of a server, the cost of a desktop, the cost of running and operating an application, a trading application, is not really what you can just go buy from Amazon or Apple or Dell. The fully loaded cost of a server is 3x or 5x or 2x more than just the cost structure, right, of what it takes to procure one of these things. And as a result, the business, the CFO, the CEOs, the boardrooms get a lot of empathy, and the CIO turn that emotion-based discussion into a fact-based discussion, and that starts to make them become more on the offensive side, where the trust between the business and IT leadership is so much now that the business says, okay, you have been incredible stewards of our capital by providing this level of transparency. So we want to provide you even additional more funding for new initiatives, for new product development in the agile development sense, in new project funding, so you can become more of a chief digital officer rather than a chief information officer and create net new innovation, if you will, for the business. So we believe transparency is foundational and is table stakes. It leads to better planning, demand management with the business. It leads to a credibility of the CIO. It leads to their budgets eventually kind of going up and them managing even a bigger real estate to drive more digital innovation within the enterprise. So the offense and the defense, we believe, is paramount. And I really believe that the CIOs who don't embrace the transparency in the new digital world we live in are going to be really left behind. And this is a must-have discipline, because even we as human beings and individuals, right, have transparency into our personal budgets, into our personal pockets at home. We all use some levels of software. So, it's very hard to have transparency in a 10 million, 100 million, $1 billion IT budget when you're trying to do that on spreadsheets.
I couldn't agree with you more. I spend most of my time on the security side of the fence with transparency. And I've been in so many boardroom conversations where I've seen the CEO and the chairman of the board just raise their hand, and almost like a huge sigh of relief comes down when you can demonstrate stewardship over the facts across the entire portfolio. All of a sudden, there's this massive shift in confidence, and less on the feelings, but more because you can demonstrate the facts at scale. I think that's the biggest challenge, is at scale. And gosh, I couldn't agree with you more on what you just said.
Yeah, imagine a CIO walking into the boardroom or walking into an executive leadership meeting, and each one of their peers has a business system analytics, right, with their reporting, which, by the way, as a reminder, the CIO is the one which put those systems in place for those other functions. And now, for the first time, the CIO, even though they may not be 100% accurate in all the information, but even if it's 85, 90%, it's good enough. And now they have a true data-driven approach, which drastically changes the dialogue. And they are now viewed more as a business leader from their peers rather than just a technology leader.
Yeah, you've defined a niche, which I'm not sure if you knew that starting out, but you've definitely carved it out now. And I think that it's funny. I do believe the CIOs, I've seen them, the ones that can embrace this, they have a much more powerful dialogue, much more powerful effect at the senior level. It's not even close. I've seen CIOs walk in for budget but they run in with a spreadsheet. They run in, and it's funny. They have no language in which to communicate the complexity of what they're facing and how they're convinced that their spreadsheet has got it. But do you have a process that the CIO, like if someone was really curious about how Apptio could fit for them, could I link them to a part of your site that you think would help them understand sort of the power of what you bring to bear?
Yeah, so I would say the best resource is www.aptio.com, apptio.com. And there's a lot of information on the website, including our testimonials from some of the leading customers. Today, there are greater than 50% of the Fortune 100 companies which use Apptio, but we also have hundreds of companies with very, very small IT budgets, even as little as 10 million in IT expense, kind of using the Apptio platform. But that would be the best resource. And from there, if they wanted to engage with us, they can download collateral, but they can also request a more in-person demo or just an online demo, which gives them access. But there are many ways for CIOs to get started. One is really, I would say, basic transparency into the technology spending with very little investment. In less than 3 months, we can get a customer's cost model stood up with a lot of analytics. The second place how CIOs are starting is just by automating their existing budgeting, planning, and financial management discipline. And third way is a lot of our CIOs want transparency into their vendor spending alone, and they just want to categorize their vendor spending, find optimizations. And the fourth way is a lot of CIOs are saying, boy, I'm moving so fast in the cloud. Let me try to get control of my cloud sprawl, cloud spending. So that's a fourth area of how CIOs can get started. So easy ways for them to get started. We can also connect them and network them to their peers. It's one of the largest community of CIOs and CFOs who've adopted the solution, and we can connect them to them. And that can be done through tbmcouncil.org site. And that's a nonprofit site, and a lot of CIOs are up there, and that's another kind of great resource.
On the show notes page, I'll link to that, the TBM Council. I'll link to the cloud sprawl section, the vendor spending, the business planning, and I missed the first one, but I think that's just aptio.com.
Yeah, that's just aptio.com and the cost transparency site.
Well, Sunny, I want to thank you for your time creating a very powerful way to help CIOs, which I believe is the next evolution of leadership that CIOs are going to need to demonstrate. And I think for the amount of complexity they're handling, anything that they can do to simplify such that they can use their influence and their skills to really help businesses move forward, I think is a very, very powerful place to be in. So I want to thank you for your contribution to the community.
Thank you, Bill, so much. And you're absolutely right. The CIO function being the most strategic as world moves to digital, and number two, being the most complex. We fundamentally believe, on one hand, the strategic nature, on the other hand, the complexity, and we believe this will be one of the most strategic functions in the enterprise. We believe CIOs have the opportunity to be the CEOs of the businesses because this is a function which will balance these two vectors, and it's changing at a fast pace. So thank you for giving me the opportunity today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Well, thank you. And I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Have a great day.
Hey, thank you so much. Have a great day.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. And to get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.